Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michelle Niehaus. I am the Program Administrator for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services with the Kentucky Division for Behavioral Health, and I am thrilled that you have joined us for our very first Learning Collaborative webinar. As you look at your screens, it might feel a little bit overwhelming. We're a little overwhelmed too because this is new for all of us. On your screen, you will see Jesse Wilson, Deb Guthman, and our interpreter, Jessica Mingus. You also have access to a poll, and we ask you to participate in that, and to the PowerPoint. And later on, you will have access to downloading the PowerPoint so that you can save it for reference later. We ask that if you have questions during the webinar that you type them in the box, and I will be monitoring those and opening us up for Q&A with our presenters towards the end of our time together today. So you will see, and I think most of you have registered for a 4-part webinar series. Today we're going to give you an introduction to deaf services, and I'm really excited to know that we have people registered from Northern Kentucky, Western Kentucky, and Eastern Kentucky. We have folks who are on from universities, from private agencies, and from community mental health centers. So our goal is to provide as much information as we can to you in this format and to develop a network so that we can address some of the gaps that you'll learn about today. Today's session will focus on an introduction to deaf services. It looks like most of you have worked with a deaf person who uses ASL before. For those of you who haven't, way to go being brave and looking to be proactive in learning how to serve this population. Next month, we'll be looking at the impact of language on access to and use of treatments. That's going to be a key piece in working with the deaf community, as you'll learn from Deb and from Jesse. So how do you actually work with interpreters and serve people through interpreters? That will be addressed in December. And then finally, for our January session, we'll talk about how to move forward as a state in providing multiple pathways to recovery. We may have folks joining us from other states as well, and we can learn from their expertise. Deb is from Minnesota and California perspectives, and Jesse is from a California perspective, so we'll get a good base of knowledge from that as well. So why are we doing this collaborative? One reason, and the biggest reason, is that few specialized treatment programs exist across the U.S. People who are deaf and hard of hearing need to have specialized services at some times. They need to have full language access, and we're going to talk about how challenging that is. At the same time, deaf individuals may be more at risk than hearing people. They need the treatment, however, they're not as likely to receive it. We'll look at a few statistics around that. We all know that navigating the funding sources and state regulations and federal regulations makes it challenging. So finding the access to the right care at the right time in the right place creates additional barriers for folks. However, all treatment providers are legally obligated to provide access to deaf individuals. What that access looks like may be very different from a hearing perspective than from a deaf perspective, and so we want to address that as well. Oftentimes people think that if you provide an ASL interpreter, you're providing full access, but we know that there are a lot of nuances to serving the community, and we wanted our providers to have a better understanding of the nuances of serving the deaf community. And we want to create multiple pathways for recovery for folks so that just like we're doing for our hearing populations, deaf individuals have access to treatment and to aftercare services that meet their needs. And as we all know as well, collaboration and cross-training are absolutely critical for effectively serving deaf individuals in recovery. We established about 3 years ago a task force to address the needs of deaf individuals in recovery in Kentucky. And I know I've learned a tremendous amount and made a lot of mistakes because I know the deaf perspective a little bit and I know mental health perspective, but substance use is not my area. So by all of us coming together, we all bring our expertise to the table so that we can better serve the community. One thing that our task force did was to survey participants in the Kentucky School for Alcohol and Other Drug Studies. And what we found was that most likely providers were willing to offer individual treatment versus group treatments, or offer written materials versus group materials as a person-entered treatment. The third most common way that people addressed serving a deaf or hard of hearing person was to provide absolutely no modification at all. And as we're going to learn through this series, that sets people up for relapse, that sets people up to not show up after their first appointment, and it creates additional barriers that we don't need to have. So knowing that I don't know what I don't even know, and trying to figure out how to get more support, I reached out to our state TA network, the Technical Assistance Network, and was connected to Sharon Hesseltine. So Sharon's going to give you a very brief overview of how the network works with communities to address the opioid crisis. Sharon?
Thanks so much, Michelle. Hi, this is Sharon Hesseltine, and I am the Technology Transfer Specialist with the Opioid Response Network. I cover Kentucky and Tennessee. I actually live in Louisville. And contrary to what we see on the screen, my particular role doesn't actually have a lot to do with technology, but what I'm involved with is connecting folks who are interested in different kinds of support and technical assistance to TA providers. The Opioid Response Network is funded through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, initially through state targeted response funding. So we've been around for about a year and a half, and providing, or I should say requesting, TA through the Opioid Response Network is a pretty easy thing to do. We're available to provide support and technical assistance to organizations in the areas of prevention, treatment, or recovery. Anything, actually, what I always tell people is if it is connected in any way to opioids, we are generally able to provide support. We can provide training such as what you're participating in today, but then we can also provide individualized consultation and mentoring, strategic planning, kind of a whole host of different kinds of technical assistance supports. We have a network of TA consultants both locally and nationally. So as you're experiencing today, we've been able to leverage national technical assistance consultants to provide support, and we're working today in close partnership with our recovery partner, which is C4 Innovations, who is hosting this webinar. So if you find that you have an interest in requesting technical assistance, it's super easy to do. You just go to the address that you see on the slide, opioidresponsenetwork.org. And when you get there in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a pretty good size button that says Submit a Request. Seriously, it takes like 5 minutes to submit a request, and if that's something that you do decide to do, you'll hear from me via an email within 1 business day, and then we really have a conversation on the phone about what exactly that you're looking for and what the goals that you have for your TA support. So our role is really very much about meeting your needs and supporting you to meet the goals that your organization has. So, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's been an interesting process to learn about the regional and the national resources that are available, and also to do that cross-training that we all need. I am so excited to get to introduce to you your presenters for this series. Deb Guthman is a nationally recognized leader in substance use treatment and prevention. She helped to establish the Minnesota Chemical Dependency Program and is a published author of, I can't even count how many articles related to substance use treatment, and has been a fantastic mentor for me throughout my career. So Deb, welcome to our webinar series. Deb is also amazing at connecting people, and through Deb, I was connected to Jesse Wilson. Jesse runs a aftercare and treatment program in San Diego. He is a deaf expert and a CADC. Jesse came to the Kentucky school this past July, and we got to meet each other in person. And then he agreed to this crazy venture where we said, hey, let's try this online for a while. So thank you, Jesse, for being willing to try something new and for sharing your expertise. We don't want to eat up any more of your time, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to Jesse.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Wilson. I'm a certified alcohol and drug counselor under the state of California. I run an outpatient treatment center, and that focuses on deaf and hard of hearing participants in San Diego, California. We also operate 2 recovery homes in the area that specialize in deaf and hard of hearing clients, and they're run by deaf folks, so there's 100% access there. And I'm really happy to be here to share with you my knowledge and experience with all of you. So hopefully this can help you guys through this collaboration and partnership to best serve those communities. So I think this is great. Vincent?
Why don't you go ahead, Jesse, and then I'll say a few more words, when we move forward. I'm thrilled to be here and really just want to thank Michelle, Sharon, and then our technical experts, Melissa and Vanessa, for making this possible. We're so excited that Kentucky is interested in having more options for deaf and hard of hearing people, and thrilled that Michelle has really taken this on, moving full forward with offering a number of opportunities. Go ahead, Jesse.
Hello again. Really, I think what's important for everyone to know is that in order to provide successful treatment for deaf and hard of hearing populations, that those people need to feel welcome and they need to feel included. And a lot of ways that you can do that is just through simple identification. So you see here that oftentimes people who can hear, who provide services, might make a mistake of labeling those in the deaf and hard of hearing community inappropriately. And then that makes them feel unwelcome for treatment, and then that can impact their success in their treatment journey. Really, one of the important things to note is that a deaf person will have a specific way that they want to identify themselves. They might want to say that they're deaf, deaf-blind, or they might not want to say something like they're hearing impaired or that they're late deafened. The whole point is that how that person, deaf or hard of hearing, wants to identify themselves, that's the term that you would want to use while in treatment when you're in sessions, or whether that's individualized therapy or in groups. If you notice on the right-hand side, the use of deaf and dumb, deaf mute, and hearing impaired are really no-goes. So please don't start out using that terminology because really that can be a barrier to deaf people when they're receiving services. Another important thing to emphasize here is that there's no one way that a person is deaf or hard of hearing. Whether they're deaf, deaf-blind, or hard of hearing, everybody has their individual nuances and differences that you can expect, whether it's their ability to hear. Some deaf people do have the ability to speak and speak well. Another deaf person might not be able to speak. And during your services with those people, you have to make sure that you provide that opportunity for them to feel connected. And so when there's any sort of questions or dialogue, you want to make sure that you're addressing those needs. In terms of ability to use English, if somebody is deaf, deaf-blind, hard of hearing, it does not matter. Everybody's going to have their own individual differences, and that can be based on the familial background that they have, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, all of that sort of background that might impact this. Some deaf people can write really well. Some English is not their preferred language, and they might have trouble utilizing English. A lot of people prefer ASL as their primary mode of communication. And then we have their functional skills, and you're going to see a lot of variety there. There's no one skill set that is, standard among everybody. during services and treatment, what you might notice and you might get a sense of is how to best accommodate them. Is it through notes or whatever skill level that they have? So just remember that there's no one way that everybody is the same when it comes to deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing people. Okay, I think this is you, Deb.
Great. We're going to be using terminology interchangeably. Sometimes we'll be referring to the deaf community. Sometimes we'll be referring to the deaf and hard of hearing community. Frequently within the field, people sort of group together deaf and hard of hearing to mean people who either use sign language or who don't use sign language. And as Jesse said, it really depends on self-identification. And maybe as we move forward, we can talk about when you have a client who is deaf in your program or hard of hearing, how best to chart in the materials that you're doing medically and terminology that might work best in that situation. So feel free if you have questions like that as we move along. We're more than happy to look at that as well. Barriers. Lack of awareness in the deaf community really is one of the largest barriers, and really it starts in school with prevention. We know that primary prevention needs to happen prior to first use. And as Michelle mentioned, I started the Minnesota Chemical Dependency Program, which serves deaf and hard of hearing people, about 30 years ago. And it's got the largest demographic data that's been kept, which I'll talk about later on. But one of the questions asked of individuals who come into treatment is, when did you first start using? How old were you? And the majority of the individuals who have attended that program indicate age 10. And if we look further in school settings, if there's any kind of prevention, it's typically not until maybe 9th grade in a health class, if that. You have to understand that there's a great deal of pressure put on schools for the deaf and teachers working with deaf kids to get through high school, pass exit exams, and academics are focused. And unfortunately, one of the things that goes by the wayside is this very important issue of prevention. So kids only learn from each other, which then goes into adulthood as a problem, not understanding the dangers and issues that come along with drug and alcohol use. The other big lack of awareness issue has to do with socialization. In some parts of the country, there's a heavy emphasis with alcohol being part of events in the deaf community. Whether we're talking about softball tournaments, golf tournaments, there's a big focus. And clients that I've had that return to their community and try to maintain sobriety feel very pressured from other individuals who keep saying, well, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you drinking? There's nothing wrong with that. There's this negative stigma within the community if a person makes that choice. Unlike where we may see in some other parts of the country in the hearing community, where it's fine to say, I choose not to drink today, or I'm going to be the designated driver. In some parts of the country in the deaf community, there's this heavy pressure. And the other big issue around lack of awareness has to do with confidentiality. We have within the deaf community this grapevine-like system of communication, where for Jesse, for myself, for Michelle, for others, people in other parts of the country may know what we're doing at any given time. So in some ways it's positive and that's very cultural, but in other ways, in terms of our mindset, in a treatment program, for instance, groups are very important. And there's this fear of confidentiality that the people in the group will go out and talk about me. So one thing that I have found in those kind of settings is the importance of really trying to establish the rules and explaining what confidentiality means so that everyone understands, and not having that be an obstacle to a person's own treatment experience. We also have very few counselors trained to identify or assess people for potential drug and alcohol issues. Jesse is one of the few certified deaf individuals in the country in this field. We have a handful of hearing people who are fluent in sign language, who are certified to work in this area. And because of that, the first point of contact for many deaf and hard of hearing individuals is actually a vocational rehab counselor, a social worker, a mental health counselor, or a teacher. And in preparatory programs, those individuals may never have had a course dealing with psychopharmacology or how to identify drug and alcohol issues. They may have had an elective course, so they don't really feel comfortable doing that. And in those cases, sometimes those issues are swept under the carpet until more legal consequences or work consequences or employment consequences tend to surface. And this can be later on than it really should be. One of the biggest issues we see is that deaf people may not face appropriate consequences for their actions. And if you all leave with one concept today, that is the importance of natural consequences. Jesse and I, and Michelle, I'm sure, could tell you many, many, many stories of where it is not helpful with having consequences not given when an individual does something against the law or involves a number of issues. 90% of deaf people are actually born to hearing parents. And with that, families that I've worked with feel a great deal of guilt for causing their child to be born deaf. That can sometimes translate into enabling behavior. As an example, a mom of a 35-year-old who was continuously stealing her ATM card, stealing money, doing a number of illegal actions, but because of her own guilt, she never did turn that individual over to any kind of authorities, which only delays the realization of the problem. Going to an early age, working at a school for the deaf, as I did for many years, having kids be caught with ecstasy in their possession and actually trying to sell it across state lines through the mail to other kids at another school for the deaf. Police were contacted. The kids were taken down to the police station, and we thought they'll get some kind of consequence. Within 2 to 3 hours, they were all back at the school, and the police officer said, "Oh, we all had McDonald's. We had a great chat. They're good kids. They won't do it again." So we really need to work together on having realistic consequences and then moving forward with accessible opportunities for individuals to have treatment experiences. Additionally, we do not have accessible aftercare options, which really can hamper the success with sobriety. When I was finishing my doctorate, what I wanted to look at was what did contribute to individuals' maintenance of sobriety. So I followed 100 individuals who had completed treatment for a year after treatment. And I found that there were 3 things that contributed to their maintenance of sobriety. Number 1, having family and friends they could talk to about their sobriety. Number 2, being employed or in school. And number 3, having access to self-help groups such as 12-step meetings. And we know that in some communities around the country, there may be no accessible interpreted 12-step meetings, where in other parts of the country that is more of an option. So this is something we really need to work on together to increase, and I know Michelle in Kentucky is working hard with the recovering community to have more of those options. Because of these communication barriers, 12-step sponsorship can also be challenging. Because I mentioned to you there's very few opportunities and few deaf people out there in recovery, and those that are early in recovery, it may not be appropriate for them to be sponsors of another person, and there's a lot of pressure placed on those individuals. And if a hearing person is going to be a sponsor, we have some communication hurdles. Now, with technology, which we'll talk about in future trainings, there are some positive things going on in terms of some of those issues that in the past have been problematic for sponsorship. Factors in assessment is another big area of concern. I'm sure many of you have involved doing assessments with people who have different kinds of language backgrounds. And in this situation, assessors may not have worked with interpreters before, and we do have a session that's going to talk more about that. I think it's important to keep in mind that American Sign Language is another language. So certain parts of speech used in English aren't used in American Sign Language. And using written English to do an assessment would not be an effective way to communicate. And unfortunately, I know of situations where their heart is right, they're trying to do what they think is the best thing, have attempted to do assessments in written communication. We would strongly advise that not to occur. Imagine if you were having a Spanish-speaking person coming in and you did not know Spanish. It would be no different than trying to do that assessment in some kind of broken other language. It's not an effective means of communication or to gather information. It would not be advisable. There is, however, a lack of qualified interpreters who have knowledge of the terminology which we're talking about. There are some opportunities for interpreters to get training in this area, but not a lot. So if you think about a sign language interpreter, there's different areas of expertise. If I was a sign language interpreter who had only worked with young children in preschool settings, I would have a very specific vocabulary related to whatever kinds of characters were popular at that time, be it Sesame Street or something else. That person then being asked to interpret in a drug and alcohol treatment program, never having been exposed to that terminology, obviously might be problematic. So an example that I like to give, if you're doing an assessment, even if you're working with an interpreter, try to expand the concepts as much as you can. So for instance, if the question you're asking to the person is, have you ever had a DUI? A deaf person, or a hearing person for that matter, may say, oh, no. But that may be because they don't know what that means. So by expanding that concept, by saying, have you ever been drinking, gotten into a car, driven, been stopped by the police, you could go on to explain what a sobriety test is. And as you're seeing with the sign language interpreter right now, she's expanding that information. And you'll get much more valid information from the deaf individual by doing that. As we've mentioned, there's a lack of assessment and treatment options. Most of the assessments that are out there are either done in English or done through a computerized kind of system. We are developing some assessments through a grant that I'm part of online in American Sign Language, and we do plan to discuss that at a future training. So that's a step in the right direction. I think the key is to remember communication. We only have 4 specialized treatment programs in the United States where all of the staff are fluent in sign language and work directly with the clients. But that doesn't mean that you in Kentucky can't have very viable treatment programs that are accessible just by having communication and working together with Michelle and others within the community to do so. And the fact that you're here is the first step in the right direction. One of the other things that I want to talk about is research. And we don't mean for this to be sort of a gloom and doom, because there's a lot of exciting things happening out there, for instance, this webinar. So in terms of research, we know that in order to get grant funding, people want to know what's the prevalence. Are there more deaf and hard of hearing people that are at risk of substance use disorders than hearing people? Do you know that? That's always the first question asked. And in the past, there were maybe small studies or extrapolated data, or we would assume people were at greater risk because they came from hearing families where maybe communication didn't happen at home. But recently, Dr. Mike McKee, who is a deaf physician and who works at the University of Minnesota, actually looked at the National Survey on Drug Use and Health to compare substance use disorders among adults with and without self-reported hearing loss. So in 2016, for the very first time, that survey added this question: are you deaf or do you have serious difficulty hearing? Now, it's not a perfect question, because we're really interested in knowing, of the deaf community who use sign language for their primary mode of communication, is that group more at risk? This would include people who identify as having, maybe wearing hearing aids,
or just is not hearing very well, but it's a step in the right direction. And his results indicated that adults with hearing loss aged 18 to 49 years are more likely to meet criteria for a substance use disorder than their hearing peers. There was no difference found for substance use disorder prevalence among adults who were 50 years and older. So this is a step in the right direction. And if any of you are interested in the citation or getting access to that article, I'd be happy to share that with you. And I think I actually did in the PowerPoint under resources. So I would welcome you to take a look at that. Jessie.
Hello again. Yeah, thank you, Deb. When we talk about treatment barriers, we know that one of the biggest things is that, really I can count on one hand the options of treatment professionals and treatment centers across the U.S. So we have California, Minnesota, there's one in New York, and the one in New York is residential. And then, like I said, we have Minnesota, which of course is for that might be out of state for some people. They do accept out of state folks, and then in California we do accept out of state people as well. But as far as the resources that are provided for drug abuse or whatever it might be, we're really limited on those different treatment options. As far as skilled professionals who are able to work with ASL and those who have knowledge of deaf culture, the deaf community, and the language is extremely limited. We hope that we can pull all of you in to provide better services. And so that's what this training really wants to address. There's lack of accessible materials. A lot of things are done written or through video with captions, or videos even without captions. And we'd like to see more accessible materials. Oftentimes we see clients who go in for treatment, but they have no idea of the resources that might be available nationwide or might be available to them. They've never actually heard of inpatient treatment, or they've never heard of outpatient treatment or the like, or behavioral health services. They're unfamiliar with those things that might be available to them. And so when they do access them and finally get services, it's a great thing. And oftentimes, they're in shock that they actually had options that were available to them. So that's what we're trying to do, as well as provide more options for the deaf and hard of hearing community. Oftentimes too, in treatment centers, counselors will typically rely on written materials to communicate with their clients. Those written materials tend to not match the language needs and the language abilities of those clients. So we really need to be able to expand on different materials, those written materials, through the use of an interpreter or an individual who is fluent in ASL, somebody who can translate those written materials into a language that's more accessible to those clients. And so that way that comprehension can happen through those different materials and through that awareness. Oftentimes, there might be another state or community where a deaf individual is looking for help or seeking treatment, and they might go into a treatment center for services and they might be denied because of the fact that the treatment center won't provide an interpreter for them. A lot of times they say that the cost of an interpreter is too high, or they don't even know how to get in contact with an interpreter to provide one, or don't know where to find interpreter agencies. A lot of treatment centers don't even know where to start or how to address the cultural and language needs of the community. It's one of the biggest problems to date that I've seen anyway. So where we are in terms of education and skilled professionals and the community, it's really that we need more resources and more options so that we can best accommodate the needs of the deaf individual seeking treatment. And again, as I mentioned, providing services for deaf individuals and deaf and hard of hearing individuals rather can be kind of unique, and it can be expensive. It's very costly at times, but really that's something that's important, I think, to all of us. And having the access to budgets and funding in order to provide that, especially in more rural states, can be difficult. In California, where I am located, we're under the drug and medical organizations that we have a certain system that we're under, the DMC ODS. So that's federally and state funded. That budget rather is available to us and that's for the whole state of California. $127 million are earmarked for that, and because of that, then we have some funding available to us, and we can tap into those resources and those funds. And so for you, that's where we can provide, interpreters or whatever it might need, or if they need spoken or sign language access, then we have that. No matter what, the language that somebody might use, Russian, Chinese, Spanish, whatever, we have a funding source for interpreters, so that way we're able to provide more accessible services. And other centers that maybe have a deaf person that they don't feel comfortable coming to my center, but they want to go to another center for whatever reason. You might potentially have personal conflicts with people at our center or with our counselors, and perhaps they prefer to go to another center, then they can. And so the budget is available for those centers to utilize that for interpreter services. Now with Medicaid in Kentucky, I'm not as familiar with how your state runs, but I know that in California, and really there's the one policy that we have that we provide the full spectrum of services in our state. And so maybe Michelle could, or Deb, or somebody could mention something about how that runs in Kentucky.
Let me just add a couple things, and then Michelle, you can as well. I wanted to just mention, going back to some of the interpreter issues Jesse was talking about, that Michelle let us know that actually in Kentucky, DBH will pay for interpreters for DUI assessments and classes. So that is something available to you. And I believe that in terms of MCOs, Passport will pay for people to go out of state to a program like Minnesota, but not always pay for interpreters. So it does seem like there's some discrepancy between how that is all handled in Kentucky. Michelle, was there anything else you wanted to add regarding the funding in Kentucky?
Sure. We have 5 different MCOs throughout Kentucky. 4 of the 5 will pay for interpreters for treatment. Passport will not. But as Deb mentioned, Passport was key in getting a Medicaid provider ID number for the Minnesota program. So if you're trying to advocate for access for your consumers who have Kentucky Medicaid, you're going to spend a lot of time on the phone trying to figure out what they will provide and what they won't, and then advocating with different levels to try to get access for them. So front door access, just to get in the door for an appointment, becomes a significant barrier, and that's before you get the person in the room and then have to figure out how to communicate with them, assess language, and then provide treatment that matches their individual needs. And we will talk more about that in future sessions as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we're on to the next topic. As Jesse mentioned, there are very few what we call specialized treatment programs, and after I finish with a few thoughts, Jesse will describe to you what the differences are between accessible treatment and specialized treatment programs. Both have pros and cons actually to them, and I think the big thing to remember is that deaf people should have a choice. Some deaf people choose to go to a treatment program with interpreters where there's maybe more anonymity. Other people may desire to go to a treatment program that is fully accessible with deaf and hearing staff fluent in sign language, only with deaf people in treatment. And what we really want to look at is making that a viable option for people, because we have so few options in most states and throughout the country. Right now, people don't really have that choice to make. Jesse mentioned there was a program in New York, there's the program in San Diego, and there's also a program in Atlanta, Georgia that serves deaf men and was actually set up through a lawsuit. Unfortunately, we see that the programs in some of the states that have been set up over the years were done because of not having accessible options. And in Georgia, it actually was a mental health related lawsuit, but they saw a need to have treatment services, so they set aside some money for that to be available. And that program is actually a treatment program within a treatment program. So it's a hearing treatment program that has 3 or 4 deaf staff that have the option to involve their clients in programs that the hearing program does, or have separate groups and activities as well. So there's a lot of different things to think about as we go through this 4-part series about what might be viable in Kentucky. So as we've alluded to, the Minnesota program, it is one of the first and the longest running inpatient treatment programs in the United States serving deaf and hard of hearing people. It opened back in 1989, just celebrated its 30-year anniversary. When it opened, we opened primarily actually as an adolescent treatment program, serving people 12 to 18 years of age. Very few people came into treatment as an adolescent. And again, that doesn't mean that there aren't deaf people, just like hearing people, as adolescents who need treatment. But I think the people in our field are so dedicated and committed. Sometimes, as I mentioned, we do too good of a job of protecting our kids from the consequences necessary for them to realize that help is needed. The program is located at Fairview University Center in Minneapolis, and at this time they are supporting that program. The clients that have been served since 1989 are 1,648. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you're thinking to yourself, again, prevalence questions, demographic questions, we've collected data on individuals who have gone through treatment since it opened. And I was just going to share one with you and then a little bit of information. If we look at self-identification, primary drug of choice, majority of the clients coming into treatment identify alcohol, followed by marijuana, and then assorted other drugs. And really, if you look at some of the national data for hearing individuals, it's actually not that much different. The other information that we've collected that I find interesting is that the average age that a male or female enters treatment is around 25 and above. And I think in our field, that's pretty much when those bridges start to be burnt. You've gone to college, maybe that's not worked. You've started to have legal consequences. The system is starting to get tired of enabling you, and consequences start to pop up. The other thing that's interesting is there's a large number more men than women that have entered the treatment program, and there's a very high coexisting diagnosis of mental health issues. So I think those are things to keep in mind as well. In fact, when some individuals enter treatment, it's sort of hard to determine what is more primary, the mental health needs or the substance use needs, and one sort of masks the other. So I think those are things important to keep in mind. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jesse.
So accessible versus specialized treatment is what we'll talk about next. Accessible treatment includes where you would provide an interpreter for direct services, and that could also include group sessions and other peer meetings or what have you. Now that person would be the only person in treatment among, all hearing people. So they would be the only deaf or hard of hearing person. And so peer support, you might experience some gaps when it comes to that. Then with specialized treatment, that's where all the staff are sign fluent in ASL, and they're very knowledgeable about deaf culture and the deaf community and can best accommodate the deaf person in terms of their needs for treatment. So that's typically the more viable option than accessible treatment. For accessible treatment for devices, that would be things like video phones or other technological devices where deaf people can call through the use of an interpreter, and oftentimes they can use that as a way to call and interact with a counselor or with somebody else in treatment, such as a peer. Ringing flashing doorbells are important to have for like the office door or wherever it might be. Visual alarms so that deaf people can be aware, and also even waking alarms if they're in a treatment center so that they know when to wake up. And written materials also need to be accessible, and they need to be modified. So there's no one way that you can put that into ASL, so a lot of times the written material needs to be modified so that way it's best understandable to the deaf client for their treatment. For specialized treatment, that's where we see pretty much all of that provided. All the accessible devices are used, and then as far as the materials, that's still a struggle for us as well, even in specialized treatment programs, because there's really no one published material or treatment program that can be used that specifically targets deaf and hard of hearing individuals with that knowledge and what have you. So we do have some printed materials that have been modified and what have you for deaf and hard of hearing people, but there's really not much out there. In terms of lack of support in recovery, usually the deaf community is quite small, and for those who are members of the community, they might only have one or two that are actually in treatment or are willing to disclose that they're in treatment or are struggling with addiction. There's a lot of stigma in the deaf community when it comes to treatment and recovery. Also, we only have a few role models out there in the deaf community of those people who have done clean and sober living and have been able to make it through treatment. Those role models are very few and far between, and so that's another struggle that we have. So that can be very challenging. A lot of people keep their issues private in the deaf community, and because they don't want the small community to gossip about them or for their information to be known. And so that can be a barrier and also cause that stigma that I mentioned. And they are worried often that people in the community will look down upon them if they're seeking recovery or treatment options. Also, just accessibility is an issue, especially with 12-step meetings. Oftentimes, there's no interpreter that's available for a 12-step meeting, or potentially the treatment options that are available don't actually provide interpreters for the long term because of the limits with budgets and funding. Factors that help long-term recovery. Really, there's a few here. Access to sober housing, where they're actually able to be in a setting where they can communicate with others through sober living. That's where a deaf person would be potentially even placed in a house with hearing people. And what you often see is when that happens, there are a lot of problems that occur because it's easy for people to blame the deaf person because they don't have the ability to communicate or defend themselves or express their own feelings and thoughts. So if the deaf person is solo in that housing, it can be very frustrating for them to be among a bunch of hearing people. And so that's where you might see a lot of relapse or those sorts of things, or their treatment goes off path. Access to sober living is quite important where they can actually communicate. Also, having accessible 12-step meeting programs in your community is very helpful to the success of recovery. That way they can get that support. And again, like we've mentioned, there's a lot of struggles for many deaf people because They may not have enough deaf people who actually persist in sober living long enough to actually have the knowledge of the 12-step and make it through the 12-step program in order to support other deaf members, so that can be a really big issue. Deaf people also can, trying to communicate with hearing people in a 12-step program can happen, but again, you typically see that there's a lot of fear around that, or they don't quite have the skills to communicate with their hearing peers in those meetings. Another important resource for deaf people who are trying to help or trying to be long-term in their recovery is to have actual resources that are available to them. So we see vocational rehab. That's a great resource for deaf people, and that can really help them persist and really rehabilitate their life in a way of like seeking work or what have you. I'm not sure we are at time, but I don't know if this is time for the question and answer portion, but I don't. Michelle, did you want to go ahead and start the question and answer portion?
Sure. Thank you for being mindful of time. I know there's so much to talk about and so many important points that you both brought up. I'm glad that we have follow-up sessions, and I really hope that everyone's interest was piqued so that you'll join for the future sessions where we're talking about more of the solutions and also more of the collaboration that has to happen to make this successful. As they put some more polling questions up, I just had a couple comments to link us into the next phase. Jesse, you mentioned vocational rehabilitation. For those of you here in Kentucky, you might not know that we have a strong network of RCDs, or Rehabilitation Counselors for the Deaf. And these are people who are regionally based, who are either deaf or who are sign fluent, who can help to bridge that gap between people who want or need employment or may be in danger of losing their employment, and to get additional resources in place. We also have communication specialists who are available for people who are hard of hearing and may need access to technology in order to maintain a job and to work in their community. So we can provide you connections to those folks as we move along. I know everyone's adjusting to having a lot of things to look at on the screen. If you notice on the question and comment section, if you have questions, we are asking you to type your questions into that pod. It looks like many of you want to continue the conversation on knowing how best to work with interpreters. We will absolutely be talking about that in the future. Aftercare options. What's interesting is that both Deb and Jesse alluded to the fact that aftercare options are pretty limited in Kentucky when we think about true access for that. And we will be discussing that. There is an Eyes on Hope task force that we've established in Kentucky, and I can send follow-up information to all of you about that. And we would love to have you participate and think about what are the things in your area that we could tap into and to address these issues. The webinar will be recorded, and so you could pass on the link to this webinar to people you would like to bring into the fold so that we can develop this network in Kentucky. And then materials as well. We'll talk about some of the materials that are out there, but honestly, working with the deaf community takes a lot of creativity, and it takes a lot of willingness to adapt to individualized needs. And it's not done alone. So we all rely on each other to be able to figure out how best to work together. In the future, we will talk about some of that adapting treatment, and we will talk about the interpreting piece and aftercare. Also, I'm seeing that people had not really considered before the obstacles to AA and for 12 steps, and that is a huge factor for our folks. Right now, our department will pay for interpreters at 12-step meetings, but that's very controversial because the 12-step meetings and the traditions say that the meetings should be self-sustaining. So we will be doing a campaign this year to borrow or steal from Jesse the idea of having I think it's called the golden bucket, where you go to intergroup meetings and go to special needs committees like they have in California and develop a process of helping those 12-step boards or functioning groups to know how to best interact with the deaf community and to recruit people to pay for meetings not saying it well in English, but we're looking at how we're going to try to partner better with people in recovery, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of sessions.
Can I add a comment about 12-step meetings?
Sure.
In Minnesota, it started very similarly to Kentucky and I'm sure in California. And one of the speakers groups, initially, interpreters would be provided through the state or through the Minnesota program would bring interpreters to the meeting. And eventually, over probably 25 years that group has had deaf people attending it, they wanted to be self-supporting, and they were able to find different ways, just like was alluded to by Michelle, to be self-supporting. And now not only do they provide interpreters every week, they record the meetings every week. And actually, anyone around the country can access the meeting. It's an open meeting, and what you see on screen is the sign language interpreter, so that a person can at least have access to that meeting, which is a great resource, not the same as being there, but for some people, another opportunity to get information. So there's a lot of creative things that some communities do to help make meetings accessible. A live meeting is always best, and in the future we'll talk about how technology helps with 12-step meetings as well.
Fantastic. And I can get those resources together, and between this webinar and the second one, we can send those all to you so that you can start looking over what is available and start thinking about how that can be applied in your setting, because I think that's absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any pressing questions.
I just wanted to mention, sorry, Michelle, one other thing I see, which is definitely something that we'll want to talk about, and that is not using written communication for assessments. Because obviously, if you're in a remote area and a deaf person shows up and they need treatment, you need to do an assessment, there isn't an interpreter available, what do? The first thing you grab for is a pen and paper and try and write back and forth. And as we've said, it's not a viable means. When we talk about using interpreters and talk about technology, we'll actually talk with you about some options that are out there with what's called video remote interpreters, where there's interpreters in other locations, just like you see Jessica today, where you can actually work with that individual and have access to communication. So there's some different things that we can talk about. So that's great to see that someone raised that issue.
Absolutely, and you and I were on the same page. That was exactly what I was going to talk about next. So I believe that when we all start working with different populations, we often aren't sure if what we were doing was right. All of us do the best we can in a given situation, and our hope is that all of our bests can get better, that we can all be continually improving in our cultural humility and in how we approach different populations. So I did put my email address up in the questions and comments in case you don't want to ask your question to the whole group. Sometimes that can feel intimidating. Please feel free to contact us in between. We also want to make sure that we thank all the people who made this possible today. We thank you, Deb and Jesse, and we thank you, Jessica, for interpreting today. And special thanks to the people behind the screen. We have the C4 Innovation Center, Melissa and Vanessa, who've worked really hard with us to make this as accessible as possible, and to Sharon Hesseltine, who was the link, who bridged us all together. Looks like somebody is typing right now, so I'm going to stall for a second. Oh, here we go. She's saying thank you. Well, you're very welcome. And, you have, let's see, it looks like Jackson Lada has a fantastic segue into our next session, talking about video interpreters and confidentiality. So we will absolutely be addressing that. Do we have any final thoughts from Jesse or from Deb?
I would just like to, again, thank everyone for taking the first step of being here. We need more people to be aware of the issues and interested in advocating for the population and helping to make treatment and resources accessible for this population. So by virtue of you being here shows us that you're interested, and hopefully you'll continue participating in the trainings and take this information out to people you work with and have your colleagues join in to the next seminars as well. Jesse, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and really my goal and passion is just that we can get other people in on this collaboration to provide better services and to provide more options for our deaf and hard of hearing community, because really it's just a huge struggle for everyone out there to get treatment. And so this, you know, is live or die. It's a live or die situation. And so really, you know, we're in the business of saving lives, and really we want to make sure that we're providing the best services that we can to our clientele. But thank you again for joining.
Thank you all for your dedication to improving the lives of people who are deaf or hard of hearing who are facing addiction. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on November 25th. Tell your friends. Have a great day. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.